37 years ago, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen had made a promise that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Today, sitting in the back row of the USS Constitution ceremony hall, wearing a borrowed dress and clutching a crumpled invitation, she was about to discover that some promises echo across decades in ways no one could ever predict. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of Murphy's Diner on Harbor Street, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor where Sarah Chen had been wiping down tables for the past 15 years. At 54, she moved with the efficient grace of someone who had learned to make every motion count, though few of the regular customers ever really looked at her long enough to notice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. To them, she was simply the quiet waitress who remembered their coffee orders, never forgot to refill their cups, and somehow always appeared at their table exactly when they needed something without ever seeming to hover. Sarah had perfected the art of being invisible in plain sight. Her graying hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her uniform shirt was permanently pressed but deliberately loose-fitting, and she spoke in the soft, measured tones of someone who had learned that drawing attention was rarely beneficial. When customers made conversation, she listened with genuine interest but rarely shared anything about herself beyond the weather or the daily specials. She had become background music in their lives, essential but unremarkable. The diner itself was a testament to stubborn survival in a world that seemed determined to replace everything old with something newer and shinier. The red vinyl booths were patched with duct tape in several places. The coffee machine made concerning noises that Murphy had been promising to fix for 3 years, and the bell above the door announced each customer's arrival with the enthusiasm of someone who had given up caring about first impressions. But the food was honest, the portions were generous, and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, which kept a steady stream of dock workers, cab drivers, and early shift nurses coming through the doors. Murphy himself was a gruff Irish immigrant who had bought the place in 1987 with money he had saved from 20 years of construction work. He treated his employees fairly, never asked questions about their past, and had a policy of hiring people who needed second chances rather than those who looked good on paper. Sarah had walked through his door 15 years ago with no references, no explanation for the gap in her employment history, and hands that shook slightly when she thought no one was watching. Murphy had taken one look at her and offered her a job without even asking her last name. Over the years, Sarah had become the unofficial manager of the place, handling inventory, training new employees, and somehow keeping the ancient equipment running through a combination of mechanical intuition and what Murphy called pure stubbornness. She arrived before dawn to prep for the morning rush and often stayed late to help close, treating the diner with the kind of careful attention that most people reserved for things they actually owned. Murphy had offered to make her a partner several times, but Sarah always politely declined, claiming she preferred the simplicity of just being an employee. The truth was more complicated. Sarah Chen was hiding from a life that had ended abruptly and traumatically, and the last thing she wanted was the kind of legal documentation that came with business partnerships. She paid her taxes, renewed her driver's license, and maintained the basic paperwork required for civilian life, but she lived with the constant awareness that too much official attention could unravel the carefully constructed anonymity she had spent 15 years building. Her apartment was a studio above the hardware store 3 blocks from the diner, spartanly furnished with second-hand furniture and a few personal items that revealed nothing about her past. She had no computer, no social media presence, and a phone so old that Murphy's teenage employees regularly expressed amazement that it still functioned. Her only luxury was a small bookshelf filled with technical manuals, maritime law texts, and navigation guides that she claimed to read for relaxation, but which served a different purpose entirely. The customers who frequented Murphy's Diner came from every walk of life that Portsmouth, New Hampshire had to offer. There were the lobster boat captains who started their days at 4 in the morning with black coffee and egg sandwiches. The third shift factory workers who stumbled in around 7, looking for breakfast that would help them sleep. The office workers who grabbed coffee and pastries during their commute to jobs that required them to dress better than their paycheck suggested they could afford. Most of them had been coming to the diner long enough to have developed routines that Sarah could predict with startling accuracy. Frank Martinez always ordered 2 eggs over easy with wheat toast and asked for extra butter, which he never actually used. Linda Thompson wanted her coffee with exactly 2 sugars and cream, served in the blue mug if it was clean, and she always left a $1 tip regardless of her order size. Bobby Patterson, who drove truck for a living, ordered the same breakfast special every Tuesday and Thursday, but pretended to study the menu for several minutes before making his decision. Sarah had become an expert at reading people, a skill that served her well in the service industry, but which had been developed in a very different context. She could tell when someone was having a bad day by the way they set their coffee cup down. She knew which customers were dealing with financial problems by how long they studied the prices on the menu. She recognized the signs of relationship trouble, work stress, and family crisis in the subtle changes in behavior that most people never noticed. This ability to observe and analyze had made her valuable to Murphy in ways that went beyond her official job description. She had prevented 3 potential robberies simply by recognizing the behavioral patterns of people who were working up the courage to do something desperate. She had talked down angry customers who were taking out their frustrations on the wrong target, and she had somehow developed a reputation among the regular customers as someone who could be trusted with confidences, though she never gave advice and rarely shared her own opinions about their problems. The irony was not lost on Sarah that she had become exactly the kind of person she had spent the first part of her life protecting. The civilians who went about their daily lives without understanding how much effort went into maintaining the peaceful world they took for granted. People who worried about mortgage payments and grocery bills and whether their children were doing well in school, blissfully unaware of the kind of threats that required constant vigilance from people whose names would never appear in history books. But Sarah had made peace with her new life, or at least convinced herself that she had. There was something to be said for the predictability of civilian routine, for problems that could be solved with hard work and common sense, rather than split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. She found genuine satisfaction in the simple act of providing good service to people who appreciated it, in being part of a community that functioned on the basic principle that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The morning of Tuesday, October 15th, began like every other morning Sarah had experienced for the past 15 years. She arrived at Murphy's at 5:30, turned on the coffee machines, and began the systematic preparation that would have the diner ready for the 6 o'clock opening. The routine was so ingrained that she could perform it without conscious thought, leaving her mind free to wander to the dozen small tasks that would need attention throughout the day. Murphy arrived at 5:45, as he had every morning. For the past decade, carrying 2 newspapers and the kind of determined optimism that came from successfully running a small business in an economy that seemed designed to destroy small businesses. He was in his 70s now, moving a little slower than he had when Sarah first started working for him, but still possessing the kind of stubborn energy that suggested he had no intention of retiring anytime soon. "Morning, Sarah," he called out as he headed to his small office behind the kitchen. "Looks like we're going to have good weather for the Harbor Festival this weekend." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Should be busy. The Harbor Festival was Portsmouth's annual celebration of its maritime heritage, a 3-day event that brought thousands of visitors to the waterfront and significantly increased business for every restaurant and shop in the area. Sarah had worked through 14 previous festivals, and while she appreciated the extra tips that came with increased volume, she also dreaded the crowds of tourists who had no understanding of small-town diner etiquette. The morning rush proceeded according to its usual patterns. Frank Martinez arrived at 6:15 for his eggs and unused butter. Linda Thompson appeared at 6:45, scanning the room for her preferred booth before settling for a counter seat when it was occupied. Bobby Patterson studied the menu with theatrical intensity before ordering the breakfast special that Sarah had already started preparing the moment she saw his truck pull into the parking lot. It was during the brief lull between the early morning crowd and the mid-morning coffee break rush that Sarah noticed the envelope that had been slipped under the door sometime during the night. Her name was written on the front in elegant script that made her heart skip a beat before she forced herself to remain calm. Very few people knew her real name, and fewer still would have any reason to contact her through such an indirect method. Sarah waited until Murphy was busy with inventory in the back office before retrieving the envelope and taking it to the storage room where she could examine it without being observed. The paper was heavy, expensive, and bore the kind of formal weight that suggested official correspondence. When she opened it, her hands remained steady through years of practiced control, but something cold settled in her stomach as she read the contents. The invitation was embossed with the seal of the United States Navy and addressed to Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, though someone had carefully crossed out her former rank and written Ms. in neat handwriting above it. The ceremony was scheduled for the following Saturday at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, with reception to follow. Dress code was listed as formal civilian attire, and there was a handwritten note at the bottom that simply said, "Your country remembers. Please come, Sarah." Read the invitation 3 times before the full implications began to sink in. Someone in the military establishment not only knew where she was, but felt it was important enough to risk exposing her carefully maintained anonymity by extending a formal invitation to a ceremony that would undoubtedly be attended by hundreds of people, many of whom might recognize her despite the 15 years that had passed since her disappearance from official records. The Portsmouth Naval Shipyard was less than 10 miles from the diner, close enough that she had driven past it countless times over the years without ever feeling tempted to stop. It was where nuclear submarines were built and maintained, where some of the Navy's most advanced technology was developed and tested, and where security was tight enough that civilians needed special clearance just to enter the parking lot. It was also where Sarah had spent some of the most important years of her life, though that was information she had never shared with anyone in Portsmouth. The practical part of her mind immediately began calculating risks and contingencies. Attending the ceremony would mean revealing herself to people who might ask questions she was not prepared to answer. It would mean acknowledging a past that she had spent 15 years trying to forget. It would mean potentially compromising the safe, anonymous life she had built through careful effort and constant vigilance. But there was another part of her mind, a part that she had been suppressing for so long that she had almost forgotten. It existed, that responded to the invitation with something approaching hunger. The promise of being around people who understood what she had sacrificed, who knew the weight of the decisions she had been forced to make, who would not need explanations for the kind of hypervigilance that had become second nature to her. Sarah folded the invitation carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket, where it seemed to radiate significance throughout the rest of her shift. She went through the motions of taking orders, serving food, and making conversation with customers, but part of her attention was focused on the decision that would determine whether she remained Sarah Chen, the waitress, or acknowledged Sarah Chen, the naval officer who had disappeared from active duty under circumstances that were still classified. The lunch rush brought its usual collection of dock workers, office employees, and retirees who had discovered that Murphy's provided better food and friendlier service than the chain restaurants that dominated most of Portsmouth's dining scene. Sarah served them with her customary efficiency, but she found herself studying their faces with new attention, wondering what they would think if they knew that the woman refilling their coffee cups had once been responsible for decisions that affected national security. There was something both liberating and terrifying about the possibility of stepping out of the carefully constructed persona she had maintained for so long. For 15 years, she had been Sarah the waitress, a woman with no past worth discussing, and no ambitions beyond getting through each day with minimal complications. The idea of becoming someone else again, even temporarily, felt like stepping to the edge of a cliff and looking down. During her afternoon break, Sarah walked to the small park overlooking Portsmouth Harbor, where she often went when she needed to think without interruption. The view included the Navy Yard in the distance, its industrial buildings and security fences, a reminder of a world that operated according to very different rules than the civilian community where she had found refuge. She sat on her usual bench and tried to imagine what it would feel like to walk through those gates again, to be surrounded by people who understood the language of duty and sacrifice that had once defined her entire existence. The invitation had not specified the nature of the ceremony, but Sarah's knowledge of military protocol suggested it was likely a retirement, a promotion, or possibly a memorial service for someone whose contributions to national security could finally be acknowledged publicly. The fact that she had been specifically invited suggested that her own service record, despite its abrupt and controversial ending, was still considered significant by someone with enough authority to track her down and extend the invitation. Sarah had left active duty under circumstances that were officially classified, but unofficially understood by everyone in her chain of command. She had made a decision that saved lives but violated direct orders, and rather than face a court-martial that would have forced the Navy to publicly acknowledge operations that were supposed to remain secret, she had been allowed to quietly resign with an honorable discharge and a service record that would be sealed permanently. The decision had cost her everything she had worked 20 years to build. Her career, her pension, her relationships with colleagues who had become like family, and her sense of identity as someone whose life had meaning beyond personal concerns. But it had also saved the lives of 17 civilians who would have died if she had followed orders, and in the dark hours when she questioned every choice she had made, that fact remained the foundation that kept her from complete despair. Now 15 years later, someone wanted to acknowledge her service in a public ceremony, which meant either the classification restrictions had been lifted or someone had decided that her contributions were significant enough to risk the political complications that came with honoring an officer who had technically violated the chain of command. As Sarah sat in the park watching fishing boats return to harbor with their daily catch, she found herself remembering details about her naval career that she had spent years trying to forget. The satisfaction of leading a team of specialists who trusted her judgment completely. The intellectual challenge of solving problems that had no textbook solutions. The sense of belonging to something larger than herself, something that mattered in ways that went beyond personal ambition or recognition. She also remembered the weight of responsibility that came with making decisions that could affect the lives of thousands of people. Decisions that had to be made quickly and with incomplete information. Decisions that would be judged by people who had never faced similar circumstances. The stress that came with knowing that a single mistake could have consequences that rippled across the globe. The isolation that came with holding security clearances that prevented her from sharing the most important parts of her life with anyone who did not possess similar clearances. But mostly, she remembered the promise she had made to herself on the day she walked away from her naval career. The promise that she would find a way to build a life that mattered, even if it did not matter in the same way her military service had mattered. The promise that she would find peace with the choices she had made and the prices she had paid for making them. Sarah returned to the diner for the evening shift with the invitation still in her pocket, and a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She would attend the ceremony, not because she was ready to reclaim her former identity, but because some debts could only be repaid by showing up when called upon, regardless of personal cost or convenience. That evening, after the diner closed and Murphy had gone home to his wife and the television shows that helped him unwind from another day of small business ownership, Sarah sat in the empty restaurant with a cup of coffee and the invitation spread on the table in front of her. The silence was profound, broken only by the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. She tried to imagine what it would feel like to walk into a room full of naval officers after 15 years of serving coffee and hamburgers to dock workers and tourists. She wondered if she would recognize any of the faces, if anyone would recognize her, if the skills and knowledge that had once made her valuable to her country were still accessible after so many years of deliberate disuse. Most importantly, she wondered if attending the ceremony would provide the closure she had never quite achieved, or if it would reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal. The life she had built in Portsmouth was not the life she had planned, but it was a good life, honest and peaceful and free from the kind of moral complexity that had ultimately driven her away from military service. But as Sarah sat alone in Murphy's diner, holding an invitation that represented everything she had lost and everything she had tried to forget, she realized that some chapters of a person's life could never really be closed until they were properly acknowledged. The woman who had served her country with distinction for 20 years deserved to have her story told, even if only to an audience of military personnel who understood the cost of that service. The decision made, Sarah locked the invitation in the small safe behind the counter where Murphy kept the day's receipts and began planning for what would undoubtedly be the most significant day she had experienced since leaving the Navy. She would need clothes appropriate for a formal military ceremony, which meant shopping for the first time in years for something other than work uniforms and casual wear. She would need to prepare herself mentally for the possibility of encountering people from her past, people who might ask questions she was not prepared to answer. Most challenging of all, she would need to find a way to reconcile the person she had become with the person she had once been, to bridge 15 years of deliberate anonymity with a past that had once defined her completely. It would require her to acknowledge that Sarah Chen, the waitress, and Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen were the same person, separated by time and circumstance, but connected by choices that continued to echo across the decades. As she prepared to leave the diner and return to her small apartment above the hardware store, Sarah caught her reflection in the window that faced Harbor Street. For just a moment, she thought she could see traces of the naval officer she had once been, the woman who had commanded respect and carried responsibility that affected the lives of thousands of people. Then the moment passed, and she was once again just Sarah, the waitress who closed up Murphy's diner every night and walked home through the quiet streets of Portsmouth, carrying secrets that would never appear in any history book. The invitation to the ceremony represented more than just acknowledgement of past service. It represented the possibility of redemption, the chance to prove that the choices she had made 15 years ago had been worth the prices she had paid for making them. It represented the opportunity to show that honor and duty were not just words, but principles worth sacrificing everything to uphold. Saturday could not come soon enough, and yet Sarah found herself wishing it would never arrive. The woman who had spent 15 years hiding in plain sight was about to discover whether she still possessed the courage that had once defined her, whether the promise she had made 37 years ago still had the power to guide her actions, and whether Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen had truly disappeared or had simply been waiting for the right moment to resurface. The story of what happened during those 15 years of exile, the daily choice to remain anonymous when recognition was the thing she craved most, the struggle to find meaning in work that seemed insignificant compared to her former responsibilities, was about to reach its conclusion. And like all stories of redemption, the ending would depend entirely on whether the protagonist had learned from her past mistakes or was doomed to repeat them in a very public and potentially humiliating way. The dress shop on Market Street had clearly not seen many customers like Sarah Chen in recent years. The elderly proprietor, Mrs. Henderson, looked up from her magazine with the polite curiosity of someone trying to categorize an unexpected visitor who didn't quite fit any familiar pattern. Sarah stood in the doorway, acutely aware that her 15 years of diner uniforms and casual clothes had left her woefully unprepared for shopping for formal attire. "Can I help you find something special, dear?" Mrs. Henderson asked, setting aside her reading glasses and approaching with the careful attention of a professional who had learned to read customers' needs from subtle cues. Sarah had rehearsed this conversation during the sleepless nights since receiving the invitation, but actually speaking the words felt strange after so many years of avoiding any situation that required explanation of her background. "I need something appropriate for a military ceremony," she said quietly. "Something formal but not flashy, conservative." Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted to one of genuine interest rather than mere professional courtesy. "Oh, how wonderful! Is it for your son or daughter? Graduation from one of the academies, perhaps, or maybe a promotion ceremony." The assumption that Sarah would be attending as a family member rather than as the honoree felt both familiar and painful. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to being perceived as someone whose own accomplishments were unlikely to merit formal recognition, someone whose role would naturally be supportive rather than central. It was a perception she had deliberately cultivated, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly reminded her of everything she had given up. "It's a bit more complicated than that," Sarah replied, maintaining the careful neutrality that had become second nature. "I just need something appropriate for the occasion." Mrs. Henderson guided her through the shop's limited selection of formal wear, explaining the subtle differences between various styles and levels of formality. Sarah found herself drawn to a navy blue dress that was elegant without being ostentatious, professional without being severe. When she tried it on, the woman looking back at her from the fitting room mirror seemed like a stranger, someone who belonged in rooms where important decisions were made rather than kitchens where coffee was served. "That's perfect on you," Mrs. Henderson said when Sarah emerged from the fitting room. "You carry yourself like someone who's used to being in charge. Military background yourself, perhaps?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could deflect it with the kind of vague response that had served her well for 15 years, or she could acknowledge a truth that felt increasingly difficult to deny. "A long time ago," she said finally. "A very long time ago." Mrs. Henderson nodded with the understanding of someone who had lived long enough to recognize that everyone carried stories they were not quite ready to tell. "Well, you'll look lovely at whatever ceremony you're attending. I'm sure whoever you're there to honor will appreciate having you there." The assumption that Sarah would be honoring someone else rather than being honored herself was another reminder of how completely she had erased her former identity. As she paid for the dress and accessories, Sarah wondered if she would have the courage to correct similar assumptions at the ceremony itself, or if she would simply allow people to draw their own conclusions about why a middle-aged waitress had been invited to a formal military event. The drive to the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard on Saturday morning felt like traveling backward through time. Sarah had made this journey countless times during her years of active duty, but approaching the main gate as a civilian rather than an officer created a sense of displacement that was both familiar and deeply unsettling. The security checkpoint was more elaborate than she remembered, with multiple layers of identification, verification, and scanning, equipment that reflected the increased security consciousness of the post-9/11's era. The young sailor checking identification at the gate examined Sarah's driver's license with the careful attention of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. "Purpose of your visit, ma'am?" he asked, consulting a clipboard that presumably contained the approved visitor list. "I'm attending the ceremony this afternoon," Sarah replied, producing the invitation that had been her constant companion for the past week. "I believe I'm on the guest list." The sailor's expression changed subtly as he read the name on the invitation, though Sarah could not determine whether the change reflected recognition, confusion, or simple bureaucratic surprise. He made a phone call to someone whose authority apparently exceeded his own, speaking in the kind of measured tones that suggested he was dealing with something outside normal protocols. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to wait here for just a moment," he said after completing his call. "Someone from the ceremony planning office is coming to escort you personally." The phrase "escort you personally" carried implications that made Sarah's stomach tighten with apprehension. In her experience, personal escorts were reserved for VIPs, security risks, or people whose presence required special handling for reasons that were not always positive. She had hoped to attend the ceremony as anonymously as possible, but the special attention suggested that her invitation had generated interest beyond what she had anticipated. The woman who approached the gate 10 minutes later wore the uniform of a Navy lieutenant and carried herself with the crisp efficiency of someone who was accustomed to managing complex logistics under pressure. Her name tag read Williams, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of professional courtesy that was warm without being familiar. "Miss Chen, I'm Lieutenant Williams from the Ceremony Planning Office," she said, extending her hand with a firm grip that suggested military training. "Admiral Morrison asked me to personally ensure that you're taken care of this afternoon. It's an honor to meet you." The phrase, "it's an honor to meet you," was not something Sarah had heard in 15 years, and the genuine respect in Lieutenant Williams' voice suggested that whatever information was contained in Sarah's sealed service record had been sufficient to earn the attention of senior personnel. Sarah found herself automatically returning the kind of formal courtesy that had once been second nature, but which felt rusty after years of civilian interaction. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I appreciate the attention, though I'm sure it's not necessary." Lieutenant Williams guided Sarah through the base with the efficient precision of someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. The buildings and facilities looked much as Sarah remembered them, though there were obvious updates and improvements that reflected advances in technology and security. More importantly, the atmosphere felt familiar in a way that was both comforting and disorienting after so many years away. "The ceremony is being held in the main auditorium," Lieutenant Williams explained as they walked. "We're expecting about 300 guests, including several flag officers and some very distinguished civilians. Admiral Morrison specifically requested that you be seated in the front section, though I understand if you prefer something more discreet." The offer of discretion was clearly genuine, but Sarah recognized it as a test of sorts. Someone wanted to know whether she was prepared to publicly acknowledge her military service, or if she preferred to remain in the background where her presence would be noted but not emphasized. The decision would signal her intentions for the remainder of the ceremony and potentially influence how she was treated by other attendees. "The front section will be fine," Sarah said, surprising herself with the firmness of her response. "I'm here to honor whatever we're celebrating today. I should be where I can participate appropriately." Lieutenant Williams smiled with what appeared to be genuine approval. "I think you'll find today's ceremony quite meaningful. Admiral Morrison has been planning this for several months, and he's been very particular about ensuring that all the appropriate people are present to witness it." The phrasing suggested that Sarah's invitation had not been an afterthought, but part of a deliberate plan that required her presence for reasons she did not yet understand. As they approached the main auditorium, Sarah could see other guests arriving in the kind of formal attire that marked them as people accustomed to important occasions. Navy officers in dress uniforms, civilians in business suits, and a few individuals whose bearing suggested military backgrounds despite their Civilian clothes. The auditorium itself was larger than Sarah remembered, with tiered seating that provided excellent sightlines to a stage, decorated with Navy flags and formal podium arrangements. The front section where Lieutenant Williams led her contained reserved seating marked with small placards bearing guests' names. Sarah found her seat in the third row, close enough to the stage to observe every detail of whatever was about to unfold. As other guests filed into the auditorium, Sarah recognized several faces from her years of active duty, though she was relieved that none of them seemed to recognize her in return. The 15 years since her departure from the Navy had changed her appearance enough that casual recognition was unlikely, and her civilian clothes provided an additional layer of anonymity that allowed her to observe without being observed. The ceremony began with the traditional honors and formalities that marked all significant Navy events. The presentation of colors, the national anthem, and the invocation delivered by the base chaplain with the kind of dignity that reminded everyone present that they were participating in something larger than mere bureaucratic routine. Sarah found herself responding to the familiar rituals with an emotional intensity that surprised her, standing and sitting at the appropriate moments with muscle memory that had survived 15 years of civilian life. Admiral Morrison, when he took the stage, was not someone Sarah recognized from her years of service, but his bearing and decorations marked him as someone who had earned his position through decades of distinguished service rather than political connections. When he began speaking, his voice carried the kind of authority that came from making difficult decisions under pressure and accepting responsibility for their consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to recognize service that has often gone unacknowledged, sacrifice that has frequently been unrecognized, and courage that has usually been invisible to those who benefit from it most. Admiral Morrison began. The nature of military service sometimes requires that our most significant contributions remain classified, that our most important victories remain secret, and that our greatest heroes remain unknown to the very people they have protected. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach as she began to understand the true nature of the ceremony. This was not a routine promotion or retirement celebration. This was something far more significant and far more dangerous to the carefully constructed anonymity she had maintained for 15 years. Today, we have the privilege of acknowledging service that has remained classified for security reasons, but which can now be recognized publicly due to changes in threat assessment and international circumstances. Admiral Morrison continued. We are here to honor individuals whose contributions to national security have been significant enough to merit the highest levels of recognition, but whose service has required them to remain in the shadows until today. The Admiral's words seemed to echo through the auditorium with the weight of formal proclamation, and Sarah realized that everyone in the audience was probably wondering which of their fellow guests would be called forward for recognition. She found herself hoping desperately that her invitation had been a mistake, that she was present as a witness rather than a participant, that the next few minutes would not shatter the quiet life she had built through such careful effort. The first individual we are here to honor today served with distinction in operations that prevented potential international conflicts, saved countless civilian lives, and demonstrated the kind of moral courage that defines the finest traditions of naval service, Admiral Morrison said, consulting notes that he clearly did not need, but which provided a moment of dramatic pause. Her service required her to make decisions that prioritized human life over operational convenience, that placed ethical considerations above career advancement, and that ultimately cost her the recognition she deserved at the time those decisions were made. Sarah's heart began beating so hard that she was certain the people sitting around her could hear it. The description was specific enough to be unmistakable, but generic enough that it could apply to any number of military personnel who had faced similar moral dilemmas during their careers. She told herself that the ceremony could be honoring someone else entirely, that her presence was coincidental, that the invitation had been extended for reasons that had nothing to do with her own service record. 15 years ago, this individual made a decision that saved 17 civilian lives during a classified operation that required her to choose between following direct orders and preventing unnecessary casualties. Admiral Morrison continued, and Sarah felt the last of her hopes for anonymity evaporate like morning fog. Her choice to prioritize human life over mission parameters resulted in the successful completion of the operation with 0 civilian casualties, but also resulted in her quiet departure from active duty due to political complications that made public recognition impossible at the time. The auditorium was completely silent, except for the almost inaudible hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of ships' horns from the harbor. Sarah could feel the attention of 300 people focusing on the stage where Admiral Morrison was about to say her name, about to acknowledge service that she had convinced herself would remain forever classified, about to transform her from Sarah Chen, the waitress, into Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, the naval officer who had sacrificed her career to save civilian lives. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, United States Navy, retired, recipient of the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in the performance of duties while serving in a classified capacity during Operation Silent Harbor in 2008. The words seemed to hang in the air like thunder, and Sarah felt 15 years of careful anonymity crumble around her like a building whose foundation had been systematically undermined. Every eye in the auditorium turned toward her with the kind of focused attention that she had spent years learning to avoid, and she realized that the quiet life she had built in Portsmouth was ending as abruptly and definitively as her naval career had ended 15 years earlier. Admiral Morrison's voice continued, but Sarah could barely process the words through the rushing sound in her ears and the absolute certainty that her world was changing in ways that could never be reversed. Lieutenant Commander Chen's actions during Operation Silent Harbor prevented an international incident that could have resulted in significant loss of life and political complications that would have affected American interests throughout the region. Her decision to deviate from operational parameters in order to protect civilian populations demonstrated the kind of moral courage that represents the highest ideals of naval service. Sarah realized that everyone in the auditorium was waiting for her to respond, to acknowledge the recognition being offered, to step forward and accept the honor that was 15 years overdue. The moment stretched endlessly as she sat frozen between her desire to remain invisible and her obligation to acknowledge service that had defined the most important years of her life. Lieutenant Williams, who had remained standing near the side of the auditorium, caught Sarah's eye and nodded encouragingly, clearly understanding the internal struggle that was playing out in real time. The gesture was small but significant, a reminder that Sarah was surrounded by military personnel who understood the weight of the moment and who respected the sacrifice that was finally being acknowledged. Slowly, with movements that felt both inevitable and terrifying, Sarah stood up and began walking toward the stage where Admiral Morrison waited with the kind of patient dignity that suggested he understood exactly how difficult this moment was for her. The applause that erupted from the audience was thunderous, sustained, and filled with the kind of genuine respect that could not be manufactured or commanded. As she climbed the steps to the stage, Sarah felt the last traces of her civilian identity falling away like an old coat that no longer fit. The woman who had served coffee to dock workers and worried about inventory for Murphy's Diner was disappearing, replaced by someone who had commanded respect and carried responsibilities that affected the lives of thousands of people. The Navy cross that Admiral Morrison pinned to her dress was heavier than she remembered, both physically and symbolically. As the auditorium erupted in another round of applause, Sarah looked out at the faces of 300 people who were seeing her, not as a waitress or a civilian consultant, but as a naval officer whose service had finally been deemed worthy of public recognition. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and absolutely terrifying. Sarah Chen, the anonymous waitress, was gone forever, replaced by Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, whose story was about to become very public indeed. The weight of the Navy Cross against Sarah's chest felt like an anchor dragging her back into a world she had spent 15 years trying to forget. As Admiral Morrison's words echoed through the auditorium, she stood frozen on the stage, acutely aware that 300 pairs of eyes were studying her with the kind of intense curiosity reserved for people who had just emerged from obscurity into the harsh light of public recognition. Admiral Morrison placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his touch conveying both support and expectation. "Lieutenant Commander Chen," he said quietly, his voice meant only for her ears, "would you like to say a few words about your service?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning 15 years of silence. Sarah had imagined this moment countless times during sleepless nights, rehearsing speeches that ranged from bitter recriminations about being abandoned by the system she had served faithfully to gracious acceptance of recognition that was long overdue. But standing on the stage with hundreds of military personnel and distinguished civilians waiting for her response, all of those rehearsed words seemed inadequate for the complexity of what she was feeling. "I'm not sure I'm prepared to speak publicly about classified operations," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the careful caution of someone who had learned that even retired officers could face consequences for revealing information that remained sensitive. Admiral Morrison smiled with the understanding of someone who had navigated similar diplomatic challenges throughout his career. "The operation has been declassified specifically for today's ceremony," he said. "You're free to discuss any details you feel are appropriate for this audience." The revelation that Operation Silent Harbor had been declassified felt like another shock in a day that was rapidly accumulating life-changing revelations. Sarah had assumed that the details of her final mission would remain classified permanently, that the circumstances surrounding her departure from active duty would never be subject to public scrutiny. The knowledge that she could finally tell the complete story of what had happened during those critical 72 hours in 2008 was both liberating and terrifying. Sarah approached the microphone with the measured stride of someone who had addressed military audiences before, though never under circumstances quite like these. The auditorium fell silent with the expectant hush that preceded significant announcements, and she could feel the weight of collective attention pressing down on her like a physical force. 15 years ago, I was part of a joint Navy and CIA operation designed to prevent the transfer of advanced weapons technology to terrorist organizations. Sarah began, her voice gaining strength as she found her rhythm. The mission required infiltrating a cargo ship in international waters and neutralizing the threat without creating an international incident that could have damaged American relations with several allied nations. As she spoke, Sarah could see recognition dawning on the faces of several officers in the audience who were clearly familiar with the operation, even if they had not previously known the identity of the personnel involved. The classified nature of the mission had meant that most participants knew only their own roles, not the complete scope of what they were attempting to accomplish. The intelligence we received indicated that the ship was carrying a crew of approximately 12 individuals, all of whom were believed to be actively involved in the weapons transfer. Sarah continued. Our orders were to board the vessel, secure the technology, and eliminate all personnel on board to prevent any possibility of intelligence leaks or future operations. The clinical language of military briefings felt strange after years of civilian conversation, but Sarah found that the familiar terminology helped her maintain emotional distance from the memories she was sharing. The auditorium remained completely silent, and she could sense that everyone present understood they were hearing details about an operation that had remained classified for very good reasons. What we discovered upon boarding the ship was that The crew included 17 civilian contractors who had been hired to provide technical support, but who had no knowledge of the true nature of the cargo they were helping to transport. Sarah said, and she could hear her own voice tightening, with the emotion that always accompanied this part of the story. These were engineers, mechanics, and communication specialists who believed they were working on a legitimate shipping operation. The implications of what she was describing began to register on the faces of her audience. Military personnel understood the practical and legal complexities that arose when operations encountered unexpected civilian presence. And civilians in the audience could appreciate the moral dimensions of what Sarah had been asked to do. The mission parameters were clear, Sarah continued. Eliminate all personnel on board to prevent security leaks and ensure that the weapons technology could not be transferred to hostile organizations. From a purely tactical perspective, the presence of civilian contractors did not change the strategic importance of preventing those weapons from reaching their intended destination. Sarah paused for a moment, allowing the weight of the moral dilemma to settle over the audience before continuing with the rest of the story. She could see Admiral Morrison nodding slightly, encouraging her to continue with details that were clearly painful to revisit, but important for the audience to understand. I made the decision to deviate from mission parameters and attempt to separate the civilian contractors from the actual weapons dealers before proceeding with the elimination of hostile personnel, Sarah said. This decision required additional time, created additional risk for our team, and violated direct orders that had been issued by multiple levels of command authority. The auditorium was so quiet that Sarah could hear the faint sound of ships' horns from the harbor beyond the base perimeter. She realized that everyone present was trying to imagine themselves in her position, weighing the competing demands of military duty, personal conscience, and strategic necessity. The operation ultimately succeeded in preventing the weapons transfer and eliminating the individuals who were actively involved in terrorist support activities, Sarah continued. All 17 civilian contractors were evacuated safely and returned to their families without any knowledge of the true nature of what they had inadvertently become involved in. A murmur of approval rippled through the audience, but Sarah raised her hand to indicate that she was not finished with her account. The most difficult part of the story was yet to come, the part that explained why recognition of her service had taken 15 years and cost her everything she had worked to build during her naval career. However, my decision to prioritize civilian lives over operational efficiency created political complications that made public recognition of the mission impossible at the time, Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of reflection on the consequences of her choices. The additional time required to evacuate the civilians allowed one member of the weapons-dealing organization to escape, and intelligence gathered from his subsequent activities indicated that our operation had been compromised from the beginning. The revelation that Operation Silent Harbor had been compromised created a stir among the military personnel in the audience who understood the implications of such intelligence failures. Compromised operations meant that American personnel had been placed at risk by security breaches that could have been prevented, and that future operations might be endangered by information that had fallen into hostile hands. The investigation that followed the mission determined that my deviation from orders had not caused the security breach, but had actually prevented it from becoming much worse, Sarah continued. The civilian contractors who were safely evacuated provided intelligence that helped identify the source of the leak and prevented similar compromises in future operations. Admiral Morrison stepped forward at this point, clearly indicating that he wanted to add context that would help the audience understand the broader significance of what they were hearing. Ladies and gentlemen, the intelligence provided by those 17 civilian contractors led directly to the identification and elimination of a spy network that had been operating within the defense contractor community for more than 5 years. He said, Lieutenant Commander Chen's decision to save those lives not only upheld the moral principles that define our military service, but also prevented security breaches that could have compromised dozens of future operations. The applause that followed Admiral Morrison's statement was immediate and sustained, but Sarah could see in the faces of the audience that many people were wondering why recognition of such clearly beneficial results had taken 15 years to materialize. The answer to that question revealed the political complexities that had made her career a casualty of bureaucratic convenience rather than operational necessity. The problem was not with the results of my decision, but with the precedent it established, Sarah said when the applause subsided. Military effectiveness depends on subordinates following orders even when those orders seem morally questionable or tactically suboptimal. Publicly recognizing an officer who had violated direct orders, even for morally justifiable reasons, could have encouraged similar behavior by personnel who lacked the experience and judgment to make such decisions appropriately. The dilemma she was describing was one that every military organization faced when dealing with personnel who demonstrated initiative that exceeded their authority. Success did not automatically justify insubordination, and recognizing successful insubordination could create problems that extended far beyond individual cases. I was given the choice of accepting a court-martial that would have made the operation public and potentially compromised ongoing intelligence activities, or quietly resigning from active duty with an honorable discharge and sealed service record. Sarah continued, I chose to protect the operation and the personnel who had participated in it, even though that choice meant giving up everything I had worked 20 years to achieve. The silence that followed her statement was profound and uncomfortable. Everyone in the auditorium understood that Sarah had been forced to choose between personal recognition and operational security, between career advancement and the protection of classified activities that remained vital to national security. Lieutenant Williams, who had remained standing near the side of the auditorium throughout the ceremony, approached the stage with a folder that she handed to Admiral Morrison. The Admiral opened the folder and studied its contents for a moment, before looking back at Sarah with an expression that seemed to combine respect, regret, and something approaching vindication. Lieutenant Commander Chen, what you could not have known at the time of your resignation is that the intelligence provided by those 17 civilian contractors ultimately led to the prevention of a terrorist attack that would have killed more than 2,000 American civilians, Admiral Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of information that had remained classified until this moment. The weapons technology you prevented from being transferred was intended for use in an attack on a major American port facility that would have created economic and humanitarian consequences extending far beyond the immediate casualties. The revelation that her decision had prevented a major terrorist attack created an immediate stir among the audience, but Sarah found herself feeling strangely detached from the information. She had made her choice based on the immediate moral imperative of protecting innocent lives, not on any calculation of broader strategic consequences. Learning that her decision had prevented even greater loss of life was gratifying, but it did not change the fundamental nature of the choice she had faced. The reason recognition of your service has taken 15 years is that the investigation into the prevented attack required extensive international cooperation that could not be jeopardized by public discussion of the intelligence sources that made that cooperation possible. Admiral Morrison continued, "We are able to honor your service today because the terrorist organization involved has been completely dismantled and the intelligence networks that supported our investigation are no longer at risk of exposure." Sarah realized that she was being told not just that her service was finally being recognized, but that the recognition was possible only because years of additional intelligence work had finally made it safe to acknowledge what she had accomplished. The 15 years of anonymity had not been punishment for her actions, but protection for ongoing operations that built upon the foundation she had helped establish. There is one more element of today's ceremony that I believe will interest you greatly, Admiral Morrison said, consulting his notes again with the careful attention of someone who wanted to ensure that important details were not overlooked. 3 of the civilian contractors whose lives you saved are present in the auditorium today, and they have asked for the opportunity to thank you personally. The announcement that some of the people she had saved were present at the ceremony created another wave of emotion that Sarah was not prepared to handle. For 15 years, she had wondered about the fate of those 17 individuals, whether they had returned safely to their families, whether they had been able to continue their careers without being affected by their inadvertent involvement in a classified operation. Admiral Morrison gestured toward the audience, and 3 individuals stood up in different sections of the auditorium. The first was a man in his 60s whose graying hair and comfortable bearing suggested he had transitioned successfully from technical work to retirement. The second was a woman in her 50s wearing a business suit that marked her as someone who had achieved professional success in the civilian world. The third was a younger man whose casual attire and confident posture suggested he had found satisfaction in work that did not require formal dress codes. Dr. Robert Martinez was the senior engineering contractor on the vessel you boarded in 2008. Admiral Morrison announced as the older man began walking toward the stage. He subsequently used the technical knowledge he gained during that operation to develop security protocols that have been adopted by shipping companies throughout the world, significantly reducing the vulnerability of international cargo operations to terrorist infiltration. Dr. Martinez climbed the steps to the stage with the careful movement of someone who was no longer young but who retained the mental acuity that had made him valuable to the operation 15 years earlier. When he reached Sarah, he extended his hand with a grip that was firm and warm. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, I never knew your name or your rank until today, but I have thought about you every day for 15 years, Dr. Martinez said, his voice carrying the emotional weight of someone who had spent years wondering about the identity of the person who had saved his life. You gave me the chance to see my grandchildren grow up, to celebrate my daughter's wedding, and to continue work that has made the world a safer place. I can never adequately express my gratitude for the choice you made." The direct personal acknowledgement of how her decision had affected individual lives hit Sarah with an emotional impact that was far greater than any abstract discussion of prevented terrorist attacks or strategic intelligence victories. Dr. Martinez represented a real person whose life had continued beyond that night in 2008 because she had chosen to prioritize human life over operational convenience. Ms. Jennifer Walsh was the communications specialist whose technical expertise proved crucial in identifying the security breach that had compromised the operation. Admiral Morrison continued as the second individual approached the stage. She subsequently founded a cybersecurity company that has protected government and commercial networks from terrorist and criminal infiltration. Ms. Walsh was clearly someone who had achieved significant success in the technology sector, but when she reached Sarah, her professional composure gave way to genuine emotion. "I spent 10 years working in classified communications before I learned enough about what happened that night to understand why my life had been spared," she said. "When I founded my company, I dedicated it to preventing the kind of security breaches that put people like you in impossible positions. Every network we protect, every attack we prevent, is a tribute to the courage you showed when you chose to save us instead of following orders." The third contractor, identified as Mr. David Kim, was the mechanical engineer whose post-operation career had focused on developing safer shipping protocols. His youth relative to the other two suggested that he had been early in his career when the operation occurred, and his success in the intervening years demonstrated how the experience had shaped his professional development. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, I was 26 years old when you saved my life," Mr. Kim said when he reached the stage. I had no idea what I had gotten involved in, no understanding of the danger I was in, and no appreciation for the sacrifice you were making by choosing to protect people like me. I've spent 15 years trying to earn the chance you gave me, and I hope the work I've done has justified your decision." The presence of these three individuals transformed the abstract moral dimensions of Sarah's choice into concrete human reality. She was not looking at statistics or strategic outcomes, but at real people whose lives had continued and flourished because of a decision she had made under pressure 15 years earlier. The emotional impact was overwhelming, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way that no amount of official recognition could match. Admiral Morrison allowed the emotional reunion to continue for several minutes before indicating that the formal ceremony needed to proceed. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, in addition to the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism, it is my privilege to present you with a letter of commendation signed by the President of the United States, acknowledging your service to the nation and the strategic importance of the operation you conducted." The presidential commendation was presented in a leather folder that Sarah accepted with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of what she was experiencing. 15 years of wondering whether her sacrifice had been worthwhile, whether her choice had been the right one, whether the prices she had paid had been justified, were finally being answered with official recognition at the highest levels of government. Finally, Admiral Morrison said, "I have been authorized to offer you the opportunity to return to active duty with full restoration of rank and seniority, should you choose to resume your naval career." The offer of reinstatement hit Sarah like a physical blow. For 15 years, she had convinced herself that her military career was permanently over, that the bridge between her past and future had been burned irreparably. The possibility of returning to the world she had lost, of reclaiming the identity and purpose that had defined the most meaningful years of her life, was both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah looked out at the audience of military personnel and civilians who were waiting for her response, understanding that her decision would determine not only her own future, but also send a message about the Navy's commitment to supporting officers who placed moral courage above career convenience. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but it was also familiar in a way that reminded her of why she had chosen military service in the first place. The woman who had served coffee at Murphy's Diner for 15 years was being offered the chance to become Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen again, to return to a world where her skills and experience could make a difference in ways that extended far beyond individual interactions. It was an opportunity for redemption that she had never dared to hope for, but accepting it would mean abandoning the quiet life she had built and stepping back into a world of impossible choices and life and death consequences. Standing on the stage with the Navy Cross weighing heavy against her chest and the presidential commendation in her hands, Sarah realized that some decisions could only be made in the moment when they were required, without the luxury of extended consideration or careful analysis of potential consequences. This was one of those moments, and her response would echo through the rest of her life regardless of what she chose. The silence in the auditorium stretched like a held breath as Sarah stood at the podium, weighing Admiral Morrison's offer of reinstatement against 15 years of carefully constructed civilian life. 300 faces watched her with the kind of focused attention reserved for moments when individual decisions carried consequences that extended far beyond personal consideration. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their curiosity, and their respect pressing against her like a physical force. Sarah looked down at the presidential commendation in her hands, then out at the audience where Dr. Martinez, Ms. Walsh, and Mr. Kim stood watching her with expressions that combined gratitude, anticipation, and something that might have been hope. These were people whose lives had been fundamentally shaped by her decision 15 years ago, and her choice today would send a message about whether that sacrifice had been worthwhile. "Admiral Morrison, I'm deeply honored by the offer of reinstatement," Sarah began, her voice carrying across the auditorium with the clarity that came from years of addressing groups of people who needed to understand exactly what she was saying. For 15 years, I have wondered whether the choice I made was worth the price I paid for making it. Today, standing here with these three individuals whose lives continued because of that choice, I finally have my answer. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the audience before continuing with the decision that would define the rest of her life. However, I have learned something important during my years away from military service. There are many ways to serve your country and protect the people you care about. Some of those ways require uniforms and clearances and formal authority. Others require nothing more than showing up every day and doing work that matters to the people around you. Admiral Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sarah could see that he understood the direction her answer was taking. Military leaders learned to recognize when personnel were choosing different paths than those their superiors might prefer, and experienced officers knew that some of the most valuable service happened outside official channels. The diner where I have worked for the past 15 years serves people who keep this community functioning, Sarah continued. Dock workers who load and unload the ships that carry goods around the world. Factory workers who manufacture products that make life better for millions of people. Nurses and teachers and mechanics who solve problems and care for others without expecting recognition or reward. The audience listened with the respectful attention that military personnel reserve for explanations that help them understand decisions they might not personally make but could professionally respect. Sarah could see several officers nodding slightly, recognizing the validity of her perspective, even if they would have chosen differently. I have learned that leadership is not about rank or authority or the ability to give orders that must be followed, Sarah said. Real leadership is about showing up when people need you, regardless of whether anyone will ever know you were there. It's about making the right choice even when that choice costs you everything you thought you wanted. Ms. Walsh stepped forward from where she had been standing with the other contractors, her movement drawing the attention of everyone in the auditorium. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, may I say something?" she asked, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had built a successful business but retained the respect for military protocol that her experience with classified operations had taught her. Sarah nodded, curious about what Ms. Walsh felt compelled to add to a ceremony that had already provided more emotional revelation than anyone had anticipated. Admiral Morrison also gestured for her to proceed, recognizing that civilian perspectives sometimes provided insights that military thinking missed. For 10 years after that night, I searched for information about the naval officer who had saved my life, Ms. Walsh said, addressing the entire auditorium rather than just Sarah. I wanted to thank her, to understand what had motivated her to risk her career for people she had never met. When I finally learned enough about the operation to understand what had really happened, I realized that the most important lesson was not about military service or heroic actions or government recognition. She turned to face Sarah directly, her expression showing the kind of genuine respect that could not be manufactured or commanded. The most important lesson was about the difference between doing your job and doing what's right when those two things are not the same. You taught me that real courage is not about following orders or meeting expectations. It's about being willing to pay any price to protect people who cannot protect themselves. The auditorium erupted in sustained applause that seemed to go on forever, but Sarah barely heard it. She was thinking about Murphy's Diner and the customers who depended on her to remember their orders and listen to their problems. She was thinking about the young employees she had trained over the years, teaching them that honest work performed with dignity was worthy of respect regardless of how other people might value it. Most importantly, she was thinking about the promise she had made to herself 15 years ago, the promise to find meaning and purpose in whatever life she built after leaving the Navy. She had kept that promise by serving coffee to dock workers and remembering the names of regular customers and showing up every day to do work that mattered to the people who depended on her. Admiral Morrison, I am grateful beyond words for the recognition you have provided today, Sarah said when the applause finally subsided. But I respectfully decline the offer of reinstatement. My service to this country will continue, but it will continue in the way I have learned to serve best, by taking care of the people in my community who need someone to show up reliably, work honestly, and care about their welfare without expecting anything in return. Admiral Morrison smiled with the understanding of someone who had spent decades learning that the best officers were those who understood that leadership could take many forms. Lieutenant Commander Chen, the Navy's loss 15 years ago was your community's gain. We are honored that your service continues, even if it continues outside our formal structure. Dr. Martinez approached the podium with the careful movement of someone who had something important to say, but was not accustomed to addressing large audiences. If I may add one more thing, he said, his voice carrying across the auditorium with the authority of genuine expertise. The security protocols I developed after our experience have been adopted by shipping companies worldwide. Every implementation of those protocols includes a dedication to Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, whose moral courage made their development possible. The revelation that her name was already attached to security measures being used around the world created another stir among the audience, but Sarah found herself thinking about something much more personal. In a few hours, she would return to Portsmouth and resume her life as a waitress at Murphy's Diner. Her customers would have no idea that she had spent the day being honored for military service that prevented terrorist attacks and saved civilian lives, but that anonymity was not a burden anymore. It was a choice, and it was a choice that allowed her to serve in the way that felt most authentic to who she had become. The woman who remembered coffee orders and listened to customers' problems and showed up every day regardless of how she was feeling was the same woman who had risked her career to save 17 innocent lives. There is one final element to today's ceremony, Admiral Morrison announced, consulting his notes one last time. Lieutenant Commander Chen, the Navy would like to establish a scholarship fund in your name for the children of military personnel who demonstrate exceptional moral courage in their own lives. The fund will support education in fields that contribute to civilian safety and security, ensuring that your example continues to inspire future generations. The scholarship announcement felt like the perfect culmination of a day that had transformed her understanding of her own legacy. Sarah had spent 15 years believing that her military service had ended in professional failure and personal exile. Instead, she was learning that her choices had created ripple effects that continued to influence people and events in ways she had never imagined. As the ceremony concluded and guests began to file out of the auditorium, Sarah found herself surrounded by officers and civilians who wanted to express their respect for her service and their understanding of her decision to return to civilian life. Many of them shared stories about their own struggles to balance duty with conscience, military effectiveness with moral principle. Lieutenant Williams approached as the crowd began to thin, carrying a small box that she presented to Sarah with obvious satisfaction. This contains copies of all the correspondence related to your case, including letters from the contractors you saved and reports on the terrorist activities that were prevented as a result of your actions, she explained. Admiral Morrison thought you might want to have the complete record. Sarah accepted the box with hands that remained steady despite the emotional weight of the day. 15 years of wondering about the consequences of her decision were contained in those documents. 15 years of questions that could finally be answered with official records rather than speculation and hope. As Sarah walked through the base toward the parking area where her old Honda waited to take her back to Portsmouth, she reflected on the unexpected ways that life could circle back on itself. The woman who had lost everything by choosing to save Innocent lives had discovered that those lives had continued to create value in the world, that her sacrifice had been multiplied in ways that extended far beyond her ability to track or measure. Murphy's Diner would open for the dinner shift in 3 hours, and Sarah needed to be there to ensure that the evening customers received the same reliable service they had come to expect. Frank Martinez would want his usual coffee. Linda Thompson would need someone to listen to her concerns about her mother's health, and Bobby Patterson would pretend to study the menu before ordering the special he always chose. These people had no idea that their waitress had spent the day being honored for preventing terrorist attacks and saving civilian lives. But they knew that she could be counted on to show up, to remember their preferences, to provide the kind of steady, reliable service that made their own difficult days a little easier to manage. That knowledge was enough, more than enough. It was everything that Sarah had learned to value during 15 years of discovering that the most important service was often the most invisible, that real leadership happened in daily choices rather than dramatic moments, and that keeping promises made to yourself was sometimes more important than meeting expectations imposed by others. The drive back to Portsmouth took her along the same coastal roads she had traveled thousands of times. But everything looked different now. Not because the landscape had changed, but because she finally understood her place in it. She was not Sarah Chen the exile, the former officer who had sacrificed her career for principle. She was Sarah Chen, the community member, the reliable presence who contributed to the daily functioning of a place where people could live and work and raise families without understanding how much effort went into maintaining that peaceful normalcy. When she arrived at Murphy's Diner, she found a note from Murphy himself taped to the back door. "Sarah, took care of prep for tonight. Take the evening off. You've earned it. See you tomorrow morning, Murphy." Sarah smiled as she unlocked the door and stepped into the familiar environment that had become more home to her than any place she had ever lived. The coffee machines hummed with their usual efficiency. The prep work was completed to her exact standards, and everything was ready for another evening of serving people who needed good food, strong coffee, and someone who cared enough to remember their names. She hung up her formal dress and changed into her usual work clothes, not because she needed to work tonight, but because wearing them felt like coming home after a long journey to a place that had turned out to be exactly where she belonged. All along, the woman who had been honored for extraordinary heroism was the same woman who took pride in ordinary service, and there was no contradiction between those identities. Tomorrow she would return to the routine that had sustained her for 15 years. Customers would order their usual meals, share their daily concerns, and receive the kind of attention that made them feel valued and cared for. They would never know that their waitress had spent the day being recognized for service that had prevented terrorist attacks and saved innocent lives. But Sarah would know, and that knowledge would inform every interaction, every moment of service, every choice to show up and do work that mattered to the people who depended on her. The promise she had made 37 years ago had been kept in ways she could never have anticipated, and the woman who had once served her country in classified operations would continue serving her community in ways that were visible to anyone who paid attention. The story of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen was complete, but the story of Sarah the waitress was just beginning another chapter. And that was exactly as it should be. 6 months after the ceremony at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, Sarah Chen stood behind the counter at Murphy's Diner, watching the morning news with the same quiet attention she had given to intelligence briefings during her naval career. The lead story was about the successful prevention of a major cyber attack on American shipping infrastructure, thwarted by security protocols that the reporter credited to innovative measures developed by civilian contractors working with maritime security specialists. Sarah recognized the language immediately. The security protocols being discussed were the ones Dr. Martinez had developed based on his experience during Operation Silent Harbor, the same protocols that now carried her name in their technical documentation. Watching the news anchor describe how these measures had prevented economic damage that could have affected millions of Americans, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with understanding how individual choices could create expanding circles of positive impact. Murphy emerged from his office carrying the morning papers and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered something unexpected and potentially significant. "Sarah, there's an article in the business section about that cybersecurity company that's been in the news lately," he said, folding the paper to highlight a specific story. The founder is a woman named Jennifer Walsh who apparently credits her success to lessons learned from military contractors. Says she was inspired by a naval officer who showed her the importance of putting human welfare above operational convenience. Sarah accepted the newspaper with hands that remained perfectly steady, though something warm settled in her chest as she read Ms. Walsh's quotes about building a business philosophy based on protecting people rather than maximizing profits. The article described how Walsh Technologies had become one of the most respected cybersecurity firms in the country, specifically because it prioritized client safety over revenue generation, often taking on pro bono work for organizations that couldn't afford commercial rates, but whose security was vital to community welfare. "Interesting story," Sarah said, handing the paper back to Murphy with the same casual tone she used to comment on weather reports or sports scores. "It's nice to see someone building a successful business around helping people." Murphy studied her face with the careful attention of someone who had spent years learning to read his employees' moods and motivations. After 15 years of working together, he had developed an intuitive understanding of Sarah's personality that went beyond their professional relationship, and he had always sensed that there were depths to her background that she chose not to discuss. "You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about expanding the diner's community involvement," Murphy said, settling onto one of the counter stools with the deliberate movement of someone initiating a conversation that had been planned rather than spontaneous. "There's been talk about establishing a scholarship fund for local kids who want to pursue careers in public service. Police work, firefighting, military service, that kind of thing. I was wondering if you'd be interested in helping to organize something like that." The suggestion of establishing a scholarship fund created an immediate connection in Sarah's mind to the fund that Admiral Morrison had announced in her name, though she was careful not to let that recognition show in her expression. Instead, she poured Murphy a cup of coffee and considered the practical aspects of what he was proposing. "What kind of help were you thinking about?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about Murphy's vision for the project. "I don't have much experience with fundraising or scholarship administration." Murphy smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts about people had been validated by years of observation. "I wasn't thinking about the administrative side so much as the selection process," he said. "Choosing recipients based on character rather than just academic performance. Looking for kids who demonstrate the kind of moral courage that makes them likely to serve others well, regardless of what career path they choose." The phrase moral courage was not one that Murphy had ever used in Sarah's presence before, and its appearance in this context felt too deliberate to be coincidental. Sarah studied his face carefully, wondering how much he had deduced about her background and whether this conversation was his way of acknowledging knowledge that he had never explicitly stated. "That's an interesting criterion," Sarah said carefully. "How would you evaluate something like moral courage in teenage applicants?" Murphy leaned forward slightly, his expression showing the kind of focused attention that suggested he was about to share information that he considered significant. "I was thinking about looking for kids who had made difficult choices to help others, even when those choices cost them something personally," he said. "Students who stood up to bullying when it would have been easier to look the other way. Athletes who reported their own rule violations even when they could have gotten away with them. Young people who chose to work part-time jobs to help support their families instead of participating in activities that would have looked better on college applications. The specificity of Murphy's examples suggested that he had given considerable thought to the kind of character traits he wanted to reward, and Sarah found herself wondering whether his interest in moral courage had been influenced by years of observing her own behavior in situations that required ethical decision-making. "Those sound like good indicators of character," Sarah agreed. "People who make the right choice when no one is watching, or when making the right choice costs them something they value." The morning rush began before their conversation could continue, bringing the usual collection of dock workers, office employees, and early shift hospital staff who depended on Murphy's diner to provide the caffeine and nutrition that sustained them through demanding work schedules. Sarah moved through her routine with the efficient grace that came from years of practice, taking orders, serving food, and maintaining the kind of attentive but unobtrusive presence that made customers feel cared for without feeling crowded. But throughout the busy morning hours, she found herself thinking about Murphy's scholarship proposal and the way it connected to larger questions about how individual actions created ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. The teenagers who would benefit from such a scholarship would carry forward the values that guided their selection, potentially creating another generation of people who prioritize service to others over personal advancement. During the mid-morning lull, Sarah received a phone call that immediately captured her complete attention. The voice on the other end belonged to David Kim, the young engineer whose life she had saved 15 years earlier, and who had subsequently built a career focused on maritime safety protocols. "Miss Chen, I hope I'm not disturbing you at work," David said, his voice carrying the kind of respectful formality that suggested he understood the significance of contacting her directly. "I wanted to let you know about something that I think you'll find meaningful." Sarah moved to the quiet corner of the diner where she could speak privately without being overheard by customers or Murphy. "Of course, David. How can I help you?" "It's more about how I can help others, actually," David replied. "I've been working with the International Maritime Organization to establish safety standards for civilian contractors working on ships that might be involved in sensitive operations. The protocols we're developing will ensure that people like me never again find themselves in dangerous situations without understanding the risks they're facing." The news that David was working to protect other civilian contractors felt like another piece of the expanding legacy that had grown from her decision during Operation Silent Harbor. Sarah had saved 17 lives during that mission, but those lives had continued to create value in the world through work that protected and helped countless other people. "That sounds like important work," Sarah said. "Are you making progress with the international community?" David's voice carried obvious satisfaction as he described the positive reception his proposals had received from maritime organizations around the world. "The interesting thing is that everyone understands the need for these protections once the issues are explained properly," he said. "It turns out that most people want to do the right thing when they understand what the right thing actually is." After ending the call with David, Sarah found herself reflecting on the unexpected ways that her choices 15 years ago continued to influence events and decisions around the world. Dr. Martinez was developing security protocols that protected international shipping. Jennifer Walsh was building a cybersecurity company based on principles of service over profit. David Kim was working to establish safety standards that would protect civilian contractors from being inadvertently involved in dangerous operations. Each of these individuals was creating positive change in their respective fields, but they were all connected by the common experience of having been saved by someone who chose moral principle over operational convenience. Their work carried forward the values that had guided Sarah's decision, multiplying the impact of that single choice across decades and around the globe. The lunch rush brought a familiar collection of regular customers, but Sarah noticed several new faces among the usual crowd. One of them was a young woman in a Navy uniform who approached the counter with the kind of respectful attention that suggested military recognition of civilian service. "Excuse me, are you Sarah Chen?" the young officer asked, her voice carrying the careful formality of someone who was not entirely certain about proper protocol for the situation she was navigating. Sarah felt a familiar caution settle over her as she considered how to respond to direct recognition from active duty personnel. "I am," she said simply. "How can I help you?" The young woman extended her hand with a firm grip that spoke of military training and genuine respect. "I'm Ensign Maria Rodriguez, stationed at the shipyard. I wanted to thank you personally for the example you set for junior officers like me. The story of your service has become part of our leadership training curriculum." The revelation that her story was being used to train naval officers created a mixture of pride and discomfort that Sarah was not entirely prepared to handle. She had chosen to return to civilian life specifically to avoid the kind of attention that came with military recognition, but she was learning that some stories took on lives of their own, regardless of their subjects' preferences. "I appreciate your words, Ensign Rodriguez," Sarah said carefully. "But I hope the training emphasizes that the most important service often happens outside official channels, in daily choices to help people and do work that matters to your community." Ensign Rodriguez nodded with the kind of serious attention that suggested she was mentally recording every word for future reference. "That's exactly what our instructors tell us," she said. "They say that leadership is about showing up for people who need you, regardless of whether anyone will ever know you were there." The phrase was almost identical to words Sarah had spoken during the ceremony 6 months earlier, and hearing them repeated by a junior officer suggested that her message about service and leadership was being transmitted accurately through military training programs. The knowledge that her example was helping to shape the values of future naval officers felt like another unexpected extension of her legacy. As Ensign Rodriguez left the diner to return to her duties at the shipyard, Sarah found herself thinking about the circular nature of influence and inspiration. Her story was teaching young officers about moral courage and principled leadership, which would guide their own decisions throughout their careers, potentially creating situations where they would face choices similar to the one she had confronted 15 years earlier. The afternoon brought a visit from someone Sarah had not expected to see again. Admiral Morrison entered the diner wearing civilian clothes and the relaxed bearing of someone who was taking time away from official duties for a personal visit. His presence immediately drew the attention of several customers who recognized the bearing of senior military leadership, even when it was not accompanied by uniforms or formal protocol. "Ms. Chen, I hope you don't mind an unannounced visit," Admiral Morrison said as he approached the counter. "I was in the area for meetings at the shipyard, and I wanted to update you on some developments that I think you'll find interesting." Sarah poured him a cup of coffee and gestured toward a quiet booth, where they could speak without being overheard by other customers. "Of course, Admiral. How can I help you?" Admiral Morrison settled into the booth with obvious appreciation for the diner's comfortable atmosphere and the quality of the coffee Sarah had served him. "The scholarship fund we established in your name has received an unprecedented level of support from both military and civilian donors," he said. "We've been able to award full scholarships to 12 students this year, and the applicant pool demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage and commitment to service that you exemplified during your own career." The success of the scholarship program felt like validation of the values that had guided Sarah's choices throughout her life, but it also represented something larger. The fund was creating opportunities for young people who shared her commitment to principled service, potentially multiplying that commitment across an entire generation of future leaders. "Tell me about the recipients," Sarah said, genuinely curious about the young people who were being supported by a program established in her honor. Admiral Morrison's expression showed obvious satisfaction as he described the scholarship recipients and their backgrounds. We have a student studying cybersecurity who wants to protect critical infrastructure. A future teacher who plans to work in underserved communities. An aspiring nurse who hopes to provide healthcare in areas where medical resources are limited. Each of them demonstrated willingness to sacrifice personal advancement for the welfare of others. The diversity of career paths represented by the scholarship recipients reinforced Sarah's belief that service could take many forms, that the values of moral courage and commitment to others could be expressed through any profession that prioritized human welfare over personal gain. These students would carry forward those values into whatever fields they chose, creating ripple effects that would extend far beyond their individual careers. As Admiral Morrison prepared to leave the diner and return to his official duties, he paused at the counter with something that resembled personal gratitude rather than professional courtesy. "Sarah, I want you to know that the example you've set has influenced policy decisions at the highest levels of naval command," he said. "We're developing new training programs that emphasize moral reasoning alongside tactical skills, and we're creating support systems for officers who face the kind of ethical dilemmas you encountered." The news that her experience was influencing military policy felt like the most significant legacy of all. Future officers would receive better preparation for moral challenges and better support when they faced situations that required choosing between orders and conscience. The institutional changes that Admiral Morrison described represented systemic improvement that could prevent other officers from facing the kind of isolation and career sacrifice that Sarah had experienced. As evening approached and the dinner shift began, Sarah found herself reflecting on the unexpected ways that individual choices could create expanding circles of positive influence. Her decision to save 17 civilian contractors had led to security improvements that protected international shipping, business practices that prioritized human welfare over profit maximization, safety standards that protected civilian workers, military training that emphasized moral courage, scholarship opportunities for service-minded students, and policy changes that better supported principled leadership. Each of these outcomes had grown from her single choice to prioritize human life over operational convenience, but they had taken on lives of their own as the people she had saved and the institutions she had influenced continued to create positive change in their respective spheres of activity. The legacy she was leaving would extend far beyond her own lifetime, carried forward by people and organizations that had been touched by her example. Murphy approached the counter as Sarah prepared for the evening shift, carrying an envelope that bore the official seal of the Portsmouth city government. "This came for you today," he said, his expression showing curiosity about the formal correspondence. "Looks important." Sarah opened the envelope to find an invitation to receive the key to the city of Portsmouth in recognition of her distinguished service to the nation and exemplary contributions to community welfare. The ceremony was scheduled for the following month, with reception to follow at the historic music hall downtown. The invitation represented yet another form of recognition for service that Sarah had assumed would remain forever anonymous, but it also represented something more personal. This recognition came from her adopted community, from people who knew her as Sarah the waitress rather than Lieutenant Commander Chen, the naval officer. It acknowledged both identities as equally valuable and worthy of honor. Local recognition, Sarah said to Murphy, showing him the invitation with the same casual tone she used to share interesting news stories or customer updates. "Apparently someone nominated me for community service." Murphy read the invitation with obvious pride in his longtime employee, but his expression also showed a deeper understanding of why such recognition was appropriate. 15 years of showing up every day, treating every customer like they matter, training young employees to take pride in honest work, he said. "That kind of service deserves recognition, regardless of whatever else you might have done before I met you." The acknowledgement that Murphy understood there was more to her background than she had ever discussed felt like the final piece of acceptance that Sarah had not realized she was seeking. Her past and present could coexist without contradiction, each valuable in its own way, each contributing to a complete identity that encompassed both exceptional service and ordinary dedication. As Sarah prepared to close the diner and end another day of serving her community, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from classified naval operations to public recognition for civilian service. The path had not been direct or predictable, but it had been consistent in its commitment to protecting and caring for people who needed someone to show up reliably and do work that mattered. The woman who had once prevented terrorist attacks was the same woman who remembered coffee orders and listened to customers' problems. The officer who had saved 17 lives was the same person who trained young employees and supported community scholarship programs. There was no contradiction between these identities, only different expressions of the same fundamental commitment to service that had guided her choices for more than 30 years. Standing in the quiet diner after the last customer had left and the equipment had been cleaned for another day, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition or reward and everything to do with understanding that her life had meaning in ways both visible and invisible, official and unofficial, dramatic and routine. The promise she had made 37 years ago had been kept in ways she could never have anticipated, and the legacy she was creating would continue long after her own story had ended. Tomorrow would bring another day of ordinary service that created extraordinary value, another opportunity to demonstrate that heroism could be found in daily choices to show up and care about the welfare of others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.